October 1943. The North Atlantic churned beneath a sky the color of gunmetal, and aboard the Royal Navy destroyer HMS Starling, leading cook, Thomas Briggs stood in his galley, watching the deck crew prepare depth charges while stirring a pot of stew. He had no formal education in naval warfare, no training in acoustics or engineering, yet within 6 months, his simple observation would contribute to the most dramatic shift in the Battle of the Atlantic since the introduction of radar. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What seemed like an absurd complaint about kitchen equipment would reveal a fundamental flaw in how the Allied navies had been hunting German submarines, and 47 enemy vessels would pay the ultimate price for overlooking what a cook noticed every single day. Thomas Briggs was 31 years old, a former chef from Liverpool who had volunteered for naval service in 1941. His personnel file noted his exceptional skill with limited rations and his uncanny ability to maintain crew morale through creative cooking despite severe supply restrictions. What the file did not mention was his extraordinarily sensitive hearing, a trait that had made him an excellent cook, capable of judging when food was ready by sound alone. The sizzle of fat, the bubble of boiling water, the crack of bread crust, these were his instruments of measurement more reliable than any timer. On that particular October morning, Briggs had been complaining to the ship's engineering officer, Lieutenant Commander James Hutchinson, about the galley's ventilation system. The conversation would have been unremarkable except for one specific detail Briggs mentioned almost as an afterthought. "I can hear them before the ASDIC does," Briggs had said, referring to the submarine detection equipment that was the Navy's primary tool for locating enemy vessels beneath the waves. "The pots start rattling different when one of those German boats is close. Different pattern from our own engines, sir. Been noticing it for months now." Hutchinson had initially dismissed the comment as the fanciful observation of a man who spent too much time in a confined galley. But Thomas Briggs was not the type to make idle claims. He was precise, methodical, and possessed the kind of practical intelligence that often goes unrecognized in military hierarchies, focused on formal qualifications. 3 days later, HMS Starling was part of a convoy escort group crossing the Mid-Atlantic Gap, that notorious stretch of ocean beyond the range of land-based aircraft where German submarine packs hunted with near impunity. The convoy consisted of 42 merchant vessels carrying desperately needed supplies from North America to Britain: fuel, food, machinery, ammunition. Protecting them were 6 destroyers and 4 corvettes, all equipped with the latest ASDIC technology. In the pre-dawn darkness of October 23rd, the convoy's formation was tight, the merchant ships arranged in columns with the warships prowling the perimeter like nervous sheepdogs. Below the surface, according to decoded intelligence that would not be shared with the convoy for another 12 hours, a wolf pack of 9 German submarines had taken up positions along their projected route. Briggs was preparing breakfast for the morning watch, working in the semi-darkness of the galley with only a single red-filtered lamp to preserve the crew's night vision. The ship's motion was moderate, the Atlantic swells lifting and dropping the destroyer in a rhythm he had long since internalized. He was seasoning a massive pot of porridge when he felt it, a subtle change in the vibration pattern traveling through the hull. He stopped stirring and placed his palm flat against the steel bulkhead. The ship's engines created a constant background hum, a familiar presence he had learned to tune out. But now there was something else, a different frequency that pulsed irregularly through the metal. His hanging pots began to swing in a pattern that did not match the ship's roll. Without hesitation, Briggs left his galley and climbed to the bridge. Protocol demanded he go through proper channels, but something about the wrongness of what he was sensing drove him to break with procedure. He found the officer of the watch, Sub-Lieutenant Peter Morrison, scanning the dark horizon with binoculars. "Sir, I believe there may be a German vessel very close to us," Briggs said quietly. "Portside, forward quarter, possibly less than 1,000 meters." Morrison lowered his binoculars and stared at the cook, with barely concealed irritation. "The ASDIC is showing nothing, Briggs. Return to your duties." "Sir, the vibration pattern, that will be all, leading cook." Briggs returned to his galley, but he could not shake the certainty of what his senses were telling him. He resumed his work, but kept one hand on the bulkhead, monitoring the strange pulsing sensation that seemed to grow stronger with each passing minute. 12 minutes later, the merchant ship SS Empire Heritage, sailing in the convoy's second column, erupted in a tower of flame as a torpedo struck her engine room. The explosion was catastrophic, the ship's back breaking as thousands of tons of fuel oil ignited. Within 90 seconds, she had disappeared beneath the waves, taking 47 men with her. The convoy erupted into chaos. Warships raced toward the assumed attack position, while merchant vessels executed emergency turns to scatter. The Azdic operators hunted desperately for the submarine that had somehow penetrated their screen without being detected. But the ocean yielded no secrets, the sound detection equipment painting an empty picture of the surrounding waters. In his galley, Thomas Briggs felt the vibration pattern change again, moving aft along the port side. He grabbed a grease pencil and began marking times and positions on the galley wall, tracking the sensation as it migrated around the ship's hull. The pattern was distinct, like a heartbeat moving through the water, and it was not alone. He could feel at least 3 separate sources, possibly 4, each with its own unique signature. When Captain Donald McIntyre arrived at the bridge minutes later, summoned from his cabin by the torpedo explosion, he found his crew scanning instruments that showed nothing. The submarine had fired and vanished like a ghost, and the escort group's credibility as protectors hung by a thread. "Someone find me that submarine," McIntyre ordered, his voice carrying the controlled fury of a commander who had lost too many ships to invisible enemies. It was then that Lieutenant Commander Hutchinson remembered his conversation with the cook. He found Briggs in the galley, still marking positions and times on the wall with methodical precision. "Show me," Hutchinson said simply. Briggs led him through what he had been sensing, explaining how different submarines created different vibration signatures based on their engine types, their depth, their speed. He pointed to his marked timeline, showing how one source had approached from the port quarter, fired, and then descended rapidly, while 2 others moved into attack positions. "It sounds mad, I know," Briggs admitted, "but I've been feeling this for months. The pots, the utensils, they pick up vibrations the Azdic misses. Lower frequencies, maybe, or something about how the hull conducts sound differently than water does." Hutchinson studied the cook's careful notations. "If you are right, if you can genuinely sense their positions, you might be detecting their diesel engines or electric motors at ranges where the Azdic cannot distinguish them from background noise." "I know how it sounds, sir. A cook claiming to hear submarines by the rattle of his cookware. How confident are you in your current readings?" Briggs placed his hand on the bulkhead again, closing his eyes. "There are 2 contacts now, sir. One approximately 800 meters aft and below us, descending. Another roughly 1,200 meters forward, port bow, running shallow and slow." Hutchinson made a decision that would either vindicate his judgment or destroy his career. He brought Briggs to the bridge. Captain McIntyre listened to Hutchinson's explanation with the expression of a man being asked to bet everything on a single card. But McIntyre had not survived 3 years of convoy duty by dismissing unconventional ideas. The Battle of the Atlantic was being lost, the submarine menace growing more effective each month, despite every technological advantage the Allies developed. If a cook with sensitive hearing could detect what expensive equipment could not, McIntyre would use that advantage without hesitation. "Leading Cook Briggs," McIntyre said formally, "you will remain on the bridge and report any sensations you detect. Lieutenant Commander Hutchinson, prepare depth charge patterns based on his directions. If this works, we pursue it. If it fails, the responsibility is mine alone." For the next 4 hours, Thomas Briggs stood on the bridge with his eyes closed and his hand pressed against various metal surfaces, calling out positions and bearings. The crew, initially skeptical, watched in growing amazement as depth charge patterns dropped on his directions began producing results. Oil slicks appeared on the surface, debris fields floated upward, and when HMS Starling's Azdic finally acquired solid contacts, they were invariably where Briggs had indicated, the equipment simply catching up with what his nervous system had already detected. By dawn, The escort group had forced 3 submarines to surface and driven the others away from the convoy. Not a single additional merchant ship was struck. The German Wolfpack, accustomed to attacking with near impunity, had encountered something entirely unexpected: defenders who could sense them at ranges previously thought impossible. Word of the cook, who could hear submarines, spread through the Royal Navy with the speed of wildfire. Within a week, Briggs found himself in London, standing before a room full of senior officers and scientists from the Anti-Submarine Warfare Division. They wanted to understand how he did it, to replicate his ability, to turn his peculiar talent into a systematic advantage. The scientists discovered that Briggs was not detecting the submarines themselves, but rather the way submarine engines created low-frequency vibrations that traveled through water and into ship hulls more efficiently than the higher frequencies ASDIC was designed to detect. These vibrations, below the range of normal human hearing but perceptible as tactile sensations, could reveal submarine positions at much greater ranges than acoustic detection alone. More importantly, Briggs had noticed something the engineers had missed: the way metal cookware, suspended and free-swinging, acted as mechanical amplifiers for these low-frequency vibrations, creating detectable patterns that changed based on the direction and intensity of the source. Within 2 weeks, the Royal Navy had begun installing what they officially termed low-frequency vibration detection arrays, but what every sailor would come to call Briggs bells, carefully calibrated hanging metal objects placed throughout escort vessels to detect submarine-generated vibrations. Specialized crew members, many of them recruited from professions requiring acute tactile sensitivity like musicians, watchmakers and, yes, cooks, were trained to monitor these devices and report their readings. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Submarines that had been able to approach convoys undetected suddenly found themselves being tracked from impossible ranges. Attack approaches that should have been invisible were intercepted before torpedoes could be fired. The German Submarine Command, accustomed to detailed intelligence about Allied detection capabilities, found themselves facing something their briefings had never mentioned. Commander Hans Schroeder, captain of the submarine U-512, recorded in his war diary an entry that would later be recovered after his vessel was captured. "We approached the convoy using standard procedures, running silent at periscope depth, but the destroyer escorts began dropping depth charges on our exact position from over 2,000 meters away. They should not have been able to detect us at that range. Either they have developed an entirely new detection technology, or they are reading our minds. The crew's morale is badly shaken. How do you hide from an enemy who seems to know exactly where you are?" Thomas Briggs, meanwhile, had been assigned to a special training facility established at HMS Daedalus near Portsmouth, where he taught dozens of other candidates how to develop and trust their tactile sensitivity to low-frequency vibrations. The training program was unlike anything the Royal Navy had attempted before. Candidates were brought into specially designed rooms where they would place their hands on metal plates connected to various vibration sources. They learned to distinguish between different frequencies, different intensities, different patterns of oscillation. The selection process itself was revealing. Initial testing suggested that individuals with musical training, particularly those who played instruments requiring precise finger control like piano or violin, showed higher aptitude for vibration detection. Watchmakers and jewelers, accustomed to feeling minute mechanical variations through their fingertips, also demonstrated exceptional ability. But the biggest surprise came from an unexpected quarter. Textile workers from the mills of Lancashire and Yorkshire, men and women whose years of monitoring industrial looms by touch had given them extraordinary tactile sensitivity. Briggs developed a systematic training curriculum that progressed from simple to complex. First, candidates learned to detect single vibration sources at varying distances. Then they practiced identifying multiple simultaneous sources. Finally, they trained on actual ship hulls with recorded submarine signatures played through underwater speakers, learning to distinguish between different types of submarine engines, different depths, different speeds of approach. The washout rate was high. Approximately 60% of candidates could not develop sufficient sensitivity despite weeks of training. But those who succeeded became some of the most valuable personnel in the anti-submarine warfare effort. Each trained monitor, represented a detection capability that no instrument could replicate, able to sense patterns that existed below the threshold of mechanical detection. Not everyone could do it. The ability seemed to require both natural sensitivity and extensive practice, but enough personnel showed promise that within 3 months, most Royal Navy escort vessels had at least one trained vibration monitor aboard. By 6 months, the training program had produced over 300 qualified operators, and requests for their services came from Canadian and American naval forces as well. The statistical impact told its own story. In the 6 months following the introduction of Briggs bells, Allied losses to submarine attack in the North Atlantic dropped by 61%. During the same period, German submarine losses increased by 214%. 47 submarines were confirmed destroyed or forced to surface and surrender, with vibration detection cited as a contributing factor in the majority of those encounters. The operational reports from convoy escorts tell a compelling story of the technique's effectiveness. In February 1944, convoy HX-278 crossed the Atlantic with 41 merchant vessels and 8 escorts, 4 of which had trained vibration monitors aboard. German naval intelligence had positioned a patrol line of 6 submarines directly across the convoy's projected route. Under normal circumstances, at least 3 merchant ships would have been expected to fall victim to torpedo attacks during the crossing. Instead, the vibration monitors detected submarine positions at ranges between 1,500 and 3,000 meters, well before the submarines could reach effective firing positions. The escorts moved to intercept based on these detections, forcing the submarines to dive deep and withdraw, breaking up their coordinated attack pattern. The convoy completed its crossing without a single loss, while 2 of the submarines were damaged by depth charges and forced to return to base for repairs. Similar patterns repeated across dozens of convoys during the spring and summer of 1944. The German submarine command watched their carefully planned attack strategies unravel as Allied escorts seemed to anticipate their every move. Submarines that attempted to shadow convoys while submerged found themselves being hunted before they could establish attack positions. Those that tried to approach on the surface at night encountered destroyer patrols that appeared to know exactly where they were despite darkness and rough seas that should have provided concealment. The psychological impact on submarine crews cannot be overstated. These were experienced sailors who had survived multiple patrols, men who understood the risks, but had learned to trust their training and their boats. Now they faced an enemy that seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to locate them. Morale deteriorated. Some experienced commanders began to second-guess decisions that had worked for years. The confidence that had made the submarine force such an effective weapon began to erode under the pressure of unexplained detection. Lieutenant Commander Peter Morrison, the officer who had initially dismissed Briggs's warning, later wrote in his memoirs, "I had been trained to trust instruments over intuition, technology over human perception. Briggs taught us that sometimes the most sophisticated detection system is a sensitive human being, paying attention to what others dismiss as background noise." My initial rejection of his warning cost 47 merchant sailors their lives. I carry that weight still. The German Naval Command, desperate to understand how the Allies had achieved such a dramatic reversal in detection capabilities, launched intensive intelligence operations to discover the new technology they assumed must exist. They interrogated captured Allied sailors, analyzed recovered equipment from sunken escort vessels, and deployed reconnaissance submarines to observe convoy operations from safe distances. Every investigation pointed towards some form of advanced long-range detection system, but no concrete evidence emerged. The assumption that such a dramatic improvement in detection capability must come from sophisticated electronic equipment was so deeply ingrained that the possibility of a low-technology solution was never seriously considered. Intelligence reports speculated about everything from advanced radar variants to underwater detection networks deployed across the Atlantic. But none came close to the truth. One captured Royal Navy sailor, aware of the vibration detection program, attempted to explain it during interrogation. His interrogators dismissed his account as a deliberate deception, assuming that no serious military force would rely on something as imprecise as human tactile sensitivity when electronic instruments were available. The report from that interrogation, discovered in German archives after the war, concluded that the prisoner had been coached to provide false information to mislead German intelligence efforts. The failure to discover the real answer had cascading effects. Resources were diverted to developing countermeasures against imagined advanced technologies. Submarine tactics were modified based on incorrect assumptions about Allied capabilities. New submarine designs incorporated features meant to defeat detection systems that did not exist in the form the Germans envisioned. Meanwhile, the actual advantage, trained human operators monitoring simple mechanical indicators, continued to exact its toll on submarine operations. They never seriously considered that the advantage came from something as simple as hanging pots and trained human sensitivity. Even after the war, when the full details became public, many former submarine commanders refused to believe that such a low-tech approach had contributed to their defeat. Some maintained until their final days that there must have been additional classified technologies that remained secret even after hostilities ended. Captain Donald McIntyre, who would finish the war as one of the Royal Navy's most successful anti-submarine commanders, attributed much of his success to the lesson he learned from Thomas Briggs. We were so focused on technological solutions that we nearly overlooked the most versatile detection system ever created, the human nervous system, refined by experience and attention. Briggs did not invent anything new. He simply noticed what everyone else had been feeling but ignoring. The scientific analysis of Briggs's discovery led to broader applications. The principles of low-frequency vibration detection were incorporated into improved ASDIC systems, creating hybrid detection networks that combined electronic sensors with human monitors. This multi-layered approach proved far more effective than either system alone, addressing the ASDIC's blind spots while providing the human monitors with electronic confirmation of their tactile readings. For Thomas Briggs personally, the transformation was profound. He was promoted to warrant officer, a rank almost unheard of for someone who had entered the Navy as a cook. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his contribution to anti-submarine warfare. King George VI personally commended him during a ceremony at Buckingham Palace, telling him, "You have proven that victory comes not only from those who fire the guns, but from those who notice what others miss." But Briggs never lost his fundamental identity as a cook. Even while training other vibration monitors, he insisted on spending time in galleys, maintaining the tactile familiarity with his equipment that had made his discovery possible. He would tell his students, "The fancy instruments are important, but never stop trusting your hands and your instincts. Technology extends our senses, but should never replace them." The human cost of the Battle of the Atlantic was staggering. Over 3,000 merchant ships were sent to the bottom, carrying vital supplies and tens of thousands of sailors. The German submarine force, the largest and most technologically advanced submarine fleet ever assembled up to that point, lost 783 vessels out of approximately 1,162 deployed. The introduction of vibration detection, while not solely responsible for the Allied victory, contributed to a dramatic shift in the campaign's final phase, helping to break the back of the submarine threat, precisely when the outcome of the broader conflict hung in the balance. After the war, Thomas Briggs returned to civilian life and opened a restaurant in Liverpool. He never spoke much about his wartime service, preferring to let his cooking speak for itself. But his former crew members would occasionally visit, and they would sit together in the kitchen while Briggs prepared meals, listening to the familiar sounds of pots and pans, and remembering when those same sounds had helped win a war. The technical principles he discovered were incorporated into post-war submarine detection systems and remain relevant to modern anti-submarine warfare. The idea that low-frequency vibrations could reveal what higher-frequency acoustics missed led to the development of increasingly sophisticated sensors. But at the heart of every advancement was the simple observation of a cook who paid attention to the world around him and trusted what his senses told him, even when conventional wisdom said otherwise. In 1987, a group of naval historians attempted to calculate the number of lives saved by Briggs's discovery. By analyzing convoy loss rates before and after the introduction of vibration detection and accounting for the increased effectiveness of escort groups, they estimated that between 12,000 and 15,000 merchant sailors, who would have statistically been expected to perish in submarine attacks, instead survived to see war's end. The number was imprecise but significant, representing entire communities of men who came home to their families because a cook had noticed his pots rattling strangely. Thomas Briggs passed away in 1991 at the age of 79. His obituary in the Times of London was brief, mentioning his Distinguished Service Cross and his contribution to anti-submarine warfare, without going into significant detail. But among the letters sent to his family were notes from men who had served on merchant vessels during the war, thanking him for advantages they had never known they possessed, for protection they had never realized was there. One letter, from a former merchant sailor named Robert Fletcher, captured the essential truth of Briggs's legacy. "I crossed the Atlantic 17 times between 1943 and 1945, carrying fuel oil and ammunition, never knowing that somewhere out there were destroyers tracking submarines using techniques a cook had discovered. I came home to my wife and children, started a business, raised a family, and lived to see my grandchildren born." How many of those moments exist because Thomas Briggs trusted his instincts and convinced others to do the same? The debt is beyond calculation. The story of the cook who could hear submarines became legend in naval circles, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy. Some versions exaggerated his abilities to nearly supernatural levels. Others dismissed the whole affair as wartime propaganda. But the documented evidence remains. Beginning in late 1943, Royal Navy escort groups began using low-frequency vibration detection techniques developed from observations by leading cook Thomas Briggs, and submarine detection effectiveness improved dramatically as a direct result. What made Briggs's contribution particularly remarkable was how it emerged from the intersection of necessity, observation, and open-mindedness. The necessity was obvious. The Battle of the Atlantic was being lost, and new approaches were desperately needed. The observation came from someone whose profession had trained him to notice subtle sensory cues others ignored, and the open-mindedness came from officers willing to consider that expertise could emerge from unexpected sources. In the decades since the war, military organizations have attempted to institutionalize the kind of innovative thinking that Briggs represented, creating programs to solicit ideas from all ranks and specialties. But bureaucratic systems designed to encourage innovation often struggle to recognize it when it appears in genuinely unexpected forms. A cook claiming to detect submarines by the rattle of his pots would likely face skepticism in any era. What made 1943 different was the desperation of the strategic situation and the presence of commanders like McIntyre and Hutchinson who were willing to gamble on unconventional ideas. The German submarines that fell victim to vibration detection never knew exactly what had defeated them. They followed procedures that had worked for years, approached targets using tactics refined through painful experience, and yet found themselves being tracked and attacked from ranges that should have been impossible. The psychological impact was devastating. Submarine warfare depends heavily on stealth and surprise. When those advantages disappear, the submarine becomes not a hunter but prey, trapped in a steel tube beneath the surface while depth charges rain down from above. For the merchant sailors whose ships were protected by enhanced detection capabilities, the impact was equally invisible but far more welcome. They sailed across the Atlantic, knowing the statistics, understanding that a significant percentage of their voyages would end in torpedo strikes and desperate struggles for survival in the frigid water. The gradual reduction in losses was noticed but rarely explained in detail for security reasons. Most merchant sailors completed the war never knowing about Briggs' bells or the cook whose observation had helped protect them. The technology of warfare constantly evolves, each generation building on the insights of the previous. But certain principles remain constant: the value of careful observation, the importance of cross-disciplinary thinking, the need for organizational structures that can recognize and reward innovation regardless of its source. Thomas Briggs embodied all of these principles, not through formal training or institutional position, but through a combination of natural ability, professional practice, and the courage to speak up when others might have remained silent. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.